This game is seriously tense, with the last 35 moves being played in under 30 seconds for both players. So as a reminder for anyone who's new to this series, I'm covering the Banter Blitz Final 2020 between Magnus Carlsen and Alireza Firouzja, and they only have 3 minutes on the clock. It's online blitz chess. Magnus just won a game to level the match 4 apiece, so Alireza is now trying to strike back with the black pieces. So Magnus kicks off here with pawn to d4. He goes away from the e4 stuff. We had knight f6, knight f3, pawn d5, and now Magnus goes for bishop to f4. He doesn't want a repeat of the queen's gambit, which Alireza won in game 1. So now we had e6, pawn e3, bishop d6. Magnus drops back here. The pawn came to c5. Knight b to d2, and now there's different setups for Alireza. He goes with this early queen c7, quite a nice idea, because if you just go something like pawn c3 here, then knight b d7, there are different ways to play, but this is a nice one where you're pretty much guaranteeing to get the e5 break in. So Magnus doesn't want to allow this. He notes that on his stream, and that's why he takes this pawn on c5. Now you can't take with the bishop, of course, you lose your queen, so queen recaptures, and pawn c4 from Magnus, and he says, okay, let's go for this. Brings back good memories for me. I won in this line against Hikaru, because he'd played Hikaru 4 or 5 months earlier in the Blitz final, won that playoff, won the World Blitz in 2019. Now in that line, the bishops had come off, but very similar thing. So Alireza captures, same as Hikaru did, and now Magnus goes rook to c1. So the bishop took on g3 here. Alireza allows the h-file to open, and he doesn't think this is going to be such a big deal. But actually, after castles, he's already in some quite serious trouble. Now, if Magnus had taken with the rook here, which didn't happen, then Alireza's scrambling. So the queen would have to move away. In the game, he went to b6 in some different lines, but say he comes to e7, which is how Hikaru played, well then queen c2 is really strong. You're looking at this pawn along with the rook, and there's threats to go g4, g5 in the air. The computer already gives an advantage of over 2 for white. Really big initiative. But Magnus missed to take with the rook. He took with the bishop here, and it's not as strong because now the queen drops back to b6, and he plays bishop b3 here, clearing the c4 square for the knight, but he's just losing a few tempos, losing that initiative. So bishop d7 from Alireza. He prepares to bring that out here or here before developing the knight. And now Magnus goes knight c4, carrying on with his plan, but he missed this check on b4. And you could tell he wasn't quite in the form in this game, you know, missing checks like that. So he blocks with the queen here. Alireza captures, and probably best was just going with the knight, keeping this one a bit more forward advanced. But he takes back with the knight here, also looking to come into c4 once this one moves away, maybe here or here. And now Alireza goes knight to a6. A nice way to develop the knight here, because you're looking at c5, b4, and from there you'll be eyeing this weakened d3 square. But Magnus now had a good opportunity to play the knight into e5 here. By coming to this square, you hit the bishop and you stop it from coming to c6. If it tries to come to b5, you kick it with this pawn move. So best here would be covering with the rook, and at least you get it off the board. Now you can sit your king here. You're looking okay in this position as white. But Magnus didn't go knight e5. He went knight d6. But after the simple response bishop to c6, it covers the threat. The rook is coming to the d-file, your pawn is hit down here. Again, Magnus said he missed bishop c6, but it's a weird move to miss, of course. And now he's just a bit worse. So he goes pawn f3, covering the attack. We had rook f to d8 here. The knight hopped back, and now this knight came into b4, eyeing this sensitive d3 square. So the king jumped up the board, and now bishop b5 comes, using this pin of the knight, putting white under quite a bit of pressure here. And best would have been to play the immediate knight to b1. This is an idea that Magnus comes up with later on because he wants to bring it to c3, but what he does in the game is go pawn a3 first. And so he's losing a tempo here. The knight comes to d3, and after rook c2 coming out of the attack, we had these rooks centralising for both players, and now this knight hops back to c5, hits the bishop, forces it back to this a2 square, and what's worse is that after bishop a4, skewering the rooks, you force b3 and really make this bishop look miserable. So the bishop came back to b5, and now Magnus starts this remanoeuvre of knight to b1, looking to bring it into this c3 square. But Alireza's response was excellent, so he chops the rooks off here and then brought the knight into d5. And now you can't go knight c3, or else you're just taking this knight on c4. After the pawn recaptures, you're picking up the e3 pawn. So after knight d5, Magnus comes back to d2 here, asks Alireza what to do. And Alireza's kind of struggling for a move here. It's getting tense, they're down to 45 seconds each. And before I go on, finish off the game here, if you're enjoying this video and not subscribed to the channel, do consider subscribing, never miss a video. So here Alireza plays the really aggressive pawn to f5. Now he's trying to clamp on the e4 move, and generally he was struggling to find the right way to execute the plan, even though he knew he was better. So king e2 from Magnus, the king came to f8, and now pawn e4, Magnus thinks, okay, I need to break out here. So the capture happened, the pawn recaptured, knight f6, and now this square is weakened. Now king e3 came to cover the pawn, it's attacked twice here, and best for Alireza was to hop in, give this check, after king here, play pawn h5, because critically you now cover the e5 square from the white knight. But instead of doing this, Alireza brought his king into e7 after Magnus played king e3, and this allowed Magnus to go knight to e5. He suddenly improved that piece and limited the jumps of this knight. And now Alireza goes king d6 and notes that Magnus is actually slightly up on time. Both players are down to about 30 seconds now. And here Magnus had a beautiful tactic. Can you see the winning move in the position that would have pretty much finished the game on the spot? So the move to play here is pawn to b4. Now you can't move your knight away, or you're dropping the rook behind, it's undefended. So what if black takes the knight here, which is the threat? Well, then you can go knight f3 check, the king moves back, and you play e5 check, forking these two pieces. Now if you come to e7, we take with check. Say you come to d7, well now you can take on f6 anyway. And even though your king now defends the rook, so you think you can move the knight away, actually you can't, because after captures, king recaptures, pawn takes here, and this one's going through, it's game over. But Magnus missed to go b4, he saw the idea in the air, but he first covered his knight on e5, and this gave Alireza just the tempo to protect his rook with the king. Now Magnus went b4, but it allows black to take here, picking up the e-pawn. That was pretty much indefensible anyway. We had this exchange on c7, and Magnus now goes g4. He's going to capture this pawn on e6, but first he threatens to kick this knight and pick up its brother. So pawn h6 played, now Magnus picks up this pawn, and the king came into d6. The bishop dropped into f5 now, hitting the knight. It jumped into c3 here. We had knight f7 check, and the king came into e7. And here Magnus says, oh boy, he's going to try and flag me now. Both players are down to well under 30 seconds. It's really tight now. So the knight came back to e5, and most of Magnus's opponents, you can imagine just going back with king d6. Say we had check, king e7, like this. You know, they'll keep coming back. They'll look to make that draw. He's world champion. I've got black, but not Alireza. He goes bishop to e8 in this position, not letting the knight come back into any of these light squares here. And immediately now, Magnus makes a blunder. He goes king to d4, allowing Alireza to check here. After the king moves away, he picks up the a-pawn. The king moves again. The knight comes back to b5. There's barely 20 seconds on each clock, maybe even 15. This bishop comes back to d3. The knight comes into d6, king c3, bishop d7, hits this pawn, and it's just impossible to defend it. So Magnus pushes on with g5. Alireza jumps in, gives the check here. The king comes to d4, and now he picks up this pawn on g5. Magnus takes back, doubling the black pawns. He's 2 pawns down now. Alireza's better, he's slightly up on the clock as well. But can Magnus hold on? He's no slouch in time pressure. So he takes on d7, the king recaptures, he brings his own one in, and the knight drops back to e8, looking to come into f6. Bishop b5 check came, the king came to e7, king e5, knight d6 hits the bishop, and now watch this, this is so tricky from Alireza. So bishop d3 played, dominating the knight here. We had knight f7 check, king f5, and now an excellent move, barely seconds on the clock. Alireza goes pawn to g6. What's going on with this? Well, if you take the pawn, then knight e5 check. And Magnus says at the time he's so tricky. It's just awesome calculation in the time pressure. So the king drops back. Magnus sees it. Fair play to him. King e6, king d4. The knight comes into e5. And this is the problem. This knight is just jumping all over the board. It's so hard to keep control of when you're in this time pressure. Both players shuffling. It's just a clock race at this stage. So knight e5 came, bishop c2. This knight just keeps hopping around. It even gives this pawn, but it's no good. Magnus just doesn't have the time on the clock. He keeps giving these checks now. Soon he even moves this g-pawn down the board, and Magnus just can't keep up. He's about to get flagged. He can see it coming, but what can you do? So these were the final moves of the game. King g5, knight f6, king f5, king f7. Magnus loses on time. Alireza still had 5-6 seconds. Awesome stuff from the youngster, beating the world champion with the white pieces. To see the next game, then do tune in tomorrow, and to see the whole playlist, click here. Thanks for watching. See you soon.